A three-letter acronym walks into American conversation and gets treated like a loaded weapon. DEI. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Three words that in plain English describe a basic idea. A workplace stops pretending. The best person magically appears from the same zip codes, the same networks, the same last names, the same inherited head start. A workplace admits the gate has been tilted for a long time, then tries to level it. That's the origin story people don't like to say out loud. Because the moment DEI gets framed as leveling, it exposes the older system for what it is, a preference that never had to announce itself. And that's where the phenomenon begins. Not with DEI programs, with the panic that comes from finally naming what had been invisible. So the acronym gets dragged into the street, stripped of its definition and given a new one, by the loudest voices holding the biggest megaphones. DEI becomes code for black and unqualified. Not diversity, not equity, not inclusion, just unqualified. And once that association sticks, the weapon is built. Because now every time a black professional shows up in a high-trust role, a poison thought gets injected into the room before the person even speaks. They're only here because of DEI. That's not skepticism. That's a rigged assumption. It's the kind of assumption that does not attach itself to white men as they walk into a cockpit, an operating room, a courtroom, a boardroom. Nobody points at a white male surgeon and says, "I hope he's qualified," as if his skin is a question mark. His presence reads as normal, as earned, as default. But watch what happens when the pilot is black. A line that circulated widely captures the reflex. Conservative commentator Charlie Kirk said during a podcast discussion, "If I see a black pilot, I'm gonna be like, boy, I hope he's qualified." Fact checkers confirmed he said that. That sentence sounds small until it's placed under a microscope. Because it isn't really about aviation. It's a confession about conditioning. It reveals an internal hierarchy where whiteness equals presumed competence, and blackness triggers suspicion by default. The black pilot doesn't get to simply be a pilot. He becomes a referendum on a political program. And that's how DEI gets weaponized, not by proving it wrong, but by training people to see black excellence as evidence of cheating. The dark truth is that this reflex doesn't begin with DEI. It begins long before the acronym ever existed, because long before DEI and long before affirmative action became common words, America already ran its own unofficial hiring system, one so normalized, it didn't need a name. White and male as a qualification. That system didn't call itself diversity. It called itself fit. It didn't call itself inclusion. It called itself culture. It didn't call itself equity. It called itself merit. And the receipts are older than the talking points. Take the Tuskegee Airmen. In World War II, black pilots trained and flew combat missions while much of the country assumed they couldn't. They didn't just prove they were capable. They proved that the qualification question had never been neutral. It had always been political. PBS calls them trailblazers who served during a time of widespread racism and discrimination. No diversity, equity, and inclusion office created their competence. They had the competence, what they lacked was access, and even when access cracked open, they still had to fly with the weight of suspicion strapped to their backs like an extra parachute. That's the part that gets erased in modern DEI debates. The debate isn't really about standards. It's about who gets presumed to meet them. So when DEI becomes the villain, it functions like a cultural magic trick. Instead of asking, why did qualified people get locked out for so long? The conversation gets redirected to, what if unqualified people get let in? It swaps a historical certainty for a hypothetical fear. And that fear becomes useful, because fear can be mobilized, fear can be monetized, fear can be turned into policy. That's why the acronym becomes a target in government and institutions. For example, President Trump signed executive actions in 2025 aimed at ending DEI programs in the federal government, explicitly framing DEI as wasteful and preferencing. And legal fights over those orders continued into 2026, with major court developments reported by Reuters. But then comes the part that breaks the simplistic story. Because when DEI gets gutted, it doesn't only hit black employees. It hits anyone who benefited from the idea that doors should be wider than one demographic. ProPublica reported that the administration's DEI purge derailed the careers of highly educated civil servants, including black women, even when the jobs lost were not directly DEI programs. Federal News Network reported lawsuits and claims describing layoffs affecting dozens of women or non-binary people and dozens of people of color in connection with the purge. That's the harsh revelation hiding behind the rhetoric. Removing DEI doesn't magically create merit. It often creates reversion, a snapback to old defaults. Because when hiring and promotion are left to natural networks, inside unequal systems, the natural outcome isn't neutral. It's inherited. The powers that be don't wake up every morning and say, let's exclude people today. They do something quieter. They choose who feels safe. They choose who fits. They choose who looks like leadership, and because those instincts were trained in an environment where leadership has long been coded as white and male, the system reproduces itself without needing a conspiracy. That's why people can cheer the end of DEI while insisting they aren't biased. Because the bias isn't always a slur in the mouth. Sometimes it's a reflex in the hiring room. Now comes the question that makes the whole thing uncomfortable. If DEI is framed as preferencing, what exactly is the older preference called? Because if a society presumes competence when the face is white and male, treats that as the baseline, promotes it as merit, and only demands suspicion and proof when the face is black or female, then the society is already running a diversity program, just not a diverse one. A program that distributes opportunity by default, then calls the distribution natural. That's why the phrase white DEI hits like a nerve. Not as an insult to every white person, but as a description of a long-standing, unspoken advantage system that never had to justify itself. And here's the darkest part of all. Weaponizing DEI doesn't require proving anyone unqualified. It only requires planting the idea that their qualification does not count. Because suspicion is a form of control. When a black pilot has to carry an extra layer of doubt into the cockpit, that doubt is doing work. It's telling everyone watching, you belong here by default, he belongs here by exception. And that is the real war over DEI. Not a war over competence, a war over who gets assumed competent before they speak. So the story ends with a blunt mirror held up to the audience. If DEI means unqualified in the public imagination, then the public imagination has already decided who qualifies. And the moment awareness of that decision becomes widespread, the acronym must be destroyed because the acronym points to the thing the culture most refuses to admit. The table was never neutral. The seat was never evenly offered, and merit was never judged the same way for everyone who walked into the room.